Hi everyone, in this lecture we're going to talk about the physiology of training and the effects of aerobic and anaerobic training. This lecture will mostly focus on aerobic, and we'll talk about anaerobic kind of throughout as well. And so we're starting to put a lot of the pieces together that's been talked about all semester and how those relate to actually training and why it matters. So when it comes to principles of training, hopefully you are familiar with like the overload principle, which states training effects occur in a physiological system is exercised at a level beyond which is normally accustomed. So if the system is taxed and it's beyond what it normally experiences, there will be some type of training effect that is associated with that, because we also have the principle of specificity, which basically training effects are specific. So muscle fiber recruitments, energy systems involved, velocity of contractions, the type of contractions, whatever kind of training you're doing is going to dictate the training effect that occurs if we're beyond that normal, accustomed kind of load. And at the end of the day, everything is reversible. So gains are lost when training stops. Our body reverts back because it takes a lot of energy to keep those training effects in place. And so our body gets rid of that to save energy. So when it comes to endurance training and VO2 and VO2 max, we know that training increases your VO2 max. And so typically training to increase VO2 max is large muscle groups, dynamic activity, 20 to 60 minutes, more than or equal to 3 times a week, greater than 50% VO2, so think running. The increase in VO2 that you'll see with that training is on average 15 to 20%. Smaller increases for individuals with a high initial VO2. So if you already have a high VO2, you're not going to see the same increases as someone with a lower VO2. If you have a really high VO2, you can actually need to be at an intensity of greater than 70% of VO2 max. And also people with a really low VO2 can see an increase of around 50% of their VO2 max. So some big differences depending on where your starting point is. So do our genetics and our genes and heredity play a role in VO2 max? They actually do. About 50% of VO2 max in sedentary adults can be kind of determined by our genetics. We also know that genetics play a key role in our training response as well. So on average, you'll see that 15 to 20% kind of increase in VO2. But if you're a low responder due to your genes, it could only be 2 to 3%, and a high responder could see as great as 50%. So a large variation in training adaptations help to reveal that about 47 to 50% of our VO2 max is actually heritable. Now, that may seem like daunting, like, oh, if my genes are going to make a difference, should I even try? Well, yeah, even if you have a low VO2, we do know that exercise is still going to improve health. You just may not be a Olympic athlete at the end of the day if your genes are not helping you with that. So remember that VO2 max is defined by the Fick equation, which was VO2 max is equal to cardiac output times a VO2 difference, so arterial venous oxygen difference. And so when it comes to that, the difference in VO2 max between individuals is primarily due to stroke volume max. So that stroke volume, how much blood you pump with each heartbeat. We all have relatively same maximal heart rates. VO2 differences are pretty similar, and so it really comes down to our stroke volume. So short duration training for approximately 4 months, most of the increases we see in VO2 max come from stroke volume. Longer term training of 28 months, so 2 years or greater, so when you've been training for a long time, you'll start to see additional increases in your VO2 max coming more from that AVO2 difference. So our body's being able to pull more oxygen out of our blood and utilize that to make energy. And so this chart kind of shows you what that is, that training and the systems that increase and the VO2 max, and you can see those kind of changes that occur. So again, there are factors that go into this increase in stroke volume, from increasing contractility to increasing end diastolic volume, which could be from plasma volume and things like that. And so increasing maximal stroke volume, one of the biggest things is to increase our preload or end diastolic volume. And so we do this mainly by increasing our plasma volume, so you increase the amount of blood you have. So a lot of this is just water content. but we also increase the amount of venous return, so your body becomes better at returning blood to the heart, and your ventricle actually can hold more, so it kind of stretches out and is able to hold more. All of these help to increase stroke volume through preload. Additionally, we want to decrease afterload, so the resistance of moving blood through the system. And so our arterial constriction goes down, so our arteries get a little bigger, allowing for more blood flow, and maximal blood flow with no change in mean arterial pressure. So we increase how much blood there's moving through the system without increasing the resistance to that flow, and we also increase how strong our heart contracts. So all of these are going to help, again, with that stroke volume. And so when it comes to that, 11% of our VO2 max is, training-induced changes occur rapidly. So you'll see an increase in about 11% of your plasma volume, so an increase in your blood volume by 11%, a 7% in VO2 max, and a 10% increase in stroke volume within the first 6 days of endurance training if you've done nothing. So a week in, we see some pretty large changes. So think about adding 10% more blood volume. It's not only going to increase that, but it's going to increase weight. And so this is something you have to consider if you're working with someone who wants to lose weight and they're just now exercising, they may actually gain some weight in the first week of exercise. So the other thing we can look at is long-term training, that arteriovenous O2 difference. So what's occurring there in that long term? Well, muscle blood flow increases, and so this decreases our SNS vasoconstriction. And so this then is going to improve the ability of muscle fibers to extract O2 from the blood. So basically, if our arteries and veins are not constricted, they're opened up, blood's going to flow through them, and it's actually going to flow through at a slower rate. And so this is then going to allow for a greater capillary density over time, which is going to help slow that blood flow through the muscle, and it's going to allow more of that O2 to be extracted. And we're also going to increase the number of mitochondria that can utilize that O2. So it's not like the O2 is just going to sit there. It's going to be pulled out, and there's going to be a bigger concentration gradient because there are more mitochondria using that O2, so more O2 is pulled out. And so this does a good kind of chart that kind of helps show that VO2 max change and how that's related to AVO2 and cardiac output and the things that are interrelated to that. So remember that when it comes to endurance training, what's our effect on? This says homeostasis, but we're really more talking about steady state. Remember, there is a difference between steady state and homeostasis. Steady state's more during exercise, homeostasis is while at rest. This keeps using the word homeostasis, but really means steady state. And so our ability to perform prolonged exercise is directly related to our body's ability to maintain a steady state once we get there. And so endurance training results in numerous changes in muscle fibers to assist with this. So we shift our muscle fibers. So during endurance training, we get rid of those fast twitch type 2X and type 2A muscle fibers and start increasing the size and number of our type 1 fibers, and we increase the number of capillaries to increase blood flow. We increase the number of mitochondria to help produce energy for those fibers and more of an aerobic system. And we also learn to utilize fat more than glucose. We increase antioxidant capacity and help with our acid-base regulation. So endurance training promotes that fast to slow switch muscle fiber. Remember, anaerobic training will go the other way. We'll increase those fast twitch and decrease the slow twitch muscle fibers. So reduction in fast fibers, an increase in number of slow, which we already talked about. And so the magnitude of this change and how many change is going to be related to genetics, but also the type and duration of training. The longer we're going, the harder that exercise is, the more we're going to go to those type 1 fibers. There would be a great difference between someone who's doing 20 minutes versus 2 hours. You're definitely going to increase the number of capillaries around all of your muscle fibers to increase oxygen diffusion and removal of waste products to continue to move. And so in addition to that, we're also going to increase the volume of both our mitochondria and our muscle fibers. And we kind of already mentioned that, but this is going to help with oxidative capacity, so how much fuel we can make using oxygen. We're going to be able to utilize more fats and less glucose. And we're also going to turn over our mitochondria. So our mitochondria get damaged, they get old, and they're not as efficient. And when we do endurance training, we actually will get rid of old, damaged mitochondria faster and replace them with new ones, which allows our system to work more efficiently. So again, that increase in mitochondria helps with more oxidative phosphorylation. And so we're better able to make those to make fuel utilizing oxidative phosphorylation. But remember, it's not going to change the actual VO2 needed at any particular intensity of exercise. So if I'm running on a treadmill at 5 miles an hour, whether I'm trained or untrained, it's going to require the same amount of oxygen utilization. However, it may not be, in the trained individual, it may not be as taxing because it's not as high a percentage of our VO2, and our body is better able to handle and make that energy without it taxing our body. So it may be done at a lower heart rate, but the VO2 is still the same. So increasing mitochondrial volume helps decrease ADP because we have these ADP transporters to get them into the mitochondria. And the reason this is important is it helps to decrease the lactate concentration. So if ADP builds up in the cell will naturally want to convert pyruvate into lactate. If that is not there, then what will happen is the pyruvate will then want to turn into acetyl-CoA and not go into lactate. Also, we won't use the phosphocreatine system as much when ADP isn't present because it has nowhere to put that inorganic phosphate to make ATP. And so you can see these transporters allow more to move in. Again, we have the same VO2, but we have more transporters moving it into the mitochondria to make ATP using oxidative systems instead of our anaerobic systems, and that helps keep lactate at a lower level. And because of all this, what you'll see is a reduction in the O2 deficit at the onset of exercise. So you can see that the trained versus untrained, that curve is less steep because our systems are, that curve is more steep because what happens is our systems are able to utilize oxygen quicker at a faster rate because it can pull that ADP into the mitochondria. And at the end of the day, with all of those increases, you'll see more fatty acids being utilized and being brought into the muscle so that we can save glucose in our anaerobic systems for when we really need it, or trying to save that so we don't deplete our glucose levels. Additionally, we increase proteins that help transport fat around the blood and into the cells, and we also increase the enzymes to help break those down and get them into our mitochondria. And so again, a good system that just kind of walks you through all the changes we see based on what's going on with endurance training. So increased capillary densities, what's going on there, mitochondria, how are these interacting to basically increase our VO2 in those training adaptations. So when we do endurance training, we also see an improvement in antioxidant capacity. So antioxidants help get rid of what's called reactive oxygen species. And reactive oxygen species are oxygen molecules and other things as well, but they're oxidative components that cause damage to muscles, but also other cells in the body. Contracting muscles produce these free radicals that are needed, these free radicals that cause damage, and training actually increases the amount of oxidative enzymes. So really what I'm trying to say here is when we contract our muscles, we produce things that can cause damage to the muscles and other cells. But with training, we actually increase the things that get rid of these free radicals. And so it improves our ability to get rid of them and them not to cause effects during and after exercise. And so it actually has a protective effect not only during exercise, but also after from these free radicals. And then we also have this improvement in acid-base balance. So we're less likely to see these increases in our acidity levels. And that's because we have less pyruvate being converted to lactate. We talked about that a little bit because of that increased number of mitochondria, less utilization of carbohydrates, and more on fatty acids or fats in general. We also increase our NADH shuttles. So when there's less NADH available, there's less lactic acid formation. Because remember, to convert pyruvate into lactate, NADH has to be available. And so if there's less of it in the cell, because we're transporting it into the mitochondria, then we're going to produce less lactate. And then finally, our bodies will produce a different form of lactate dehydrogenase. So the enzyme that is converting pyruvate to lactate, there are different forms of it, isoforms. And so we start to, with training, produce more of this H4 isoform, which means that there's a less likelihood that it's going to convert pyruvate into lactate. It still will, just the conditions have to be perfect. Where with M4, the likelihood is very likely, it's very likely to happen of that conversion from pyruvate to lactate. And again, you can see kind of how all of these are playing in with increased mitochondria and eventually leading to blood pH maintained a little bit easier with training. And so this training big picture, so what's going on? Endurance and resistance exercise both promote protein synthesis. You're going to build more protein when you are training, whether that's resistance training or endurance training. Exercise is a form of stress, and it activates genes to help deal with that stress. In this case, we're going to usually build more muscle, so your body less likely to experience the feeling that it's dying. And so the process of training induced muscle adaptation, so muscle contractions activate all kinds of primary and secondary messengers, and these result in gene expressions, which eventually lead to the synthesis of new proteins. These genes and the synthesis of new proteins typically peak 4 to 8 hours after exercise, and then they're back to baseline after 24. So what this is saying is to see that increase in protein synthesis, we'll see it for a short time, and then it returns back to normal after about 24 hours. And so we need daily exercise in order to induce those adaptations, especially at a reasonable rate. And so you can see that peak and then coming back down after 24. But if you can exercise, day after day, week after week, there can be breaks in between that, but you'll see this slow, gradual increase into these levels, where one bout of exercise increase and then we're back. And so that's really important to kind of note. Let's see. I'm not as worried about this one. Basically, exercising helps improve these small molecules that decrease protein synthesis by blockade. And so basically, not too worried about that slide. Let's see, I missed that one. Primary and secondary signals lead to muscle adaptation, so they increase these. The biggest point to remember here is that these adaptations that we're seeing in this promotion of protein synthesis is going to be specific based on the exercise stimulus. So resistance versus endurance training. Resistance training, we may see a big increase in muscle fiber synthesis or muscle cell synthesis, so creating those contractile proteins. Where endurance training, what we may see is more increase in capillaries proteins being made, or mitochondrial proteins being made. Also, the intensity and duration of that training. So the effect and how much we see is going to be dependent on that as well. So the primary signaling for these skeletal muscle adaptations, this protein synthesis, will be things like mechanical stretch. So if your muscles are being stretched through resistance training, that'll signal. If you have increased levels of calcium or free radicals from endurance training, that could very well lead to it as well. But again, different changes, right? They're both going to lead to increase in muscle synthesis, but what type is going to be a little bit different. And then those are going to activate second messengers like AMP kinase, mitogen activated kinase or P38, PGC1A or alpha. This is a PGC1 alpha is a huge thing when it comes to mitochondrial biogenesis. So if we see mitochondrial biogenesis, so the creation of new mitochondria, probably going to happen with endurance exercise. If we see something that related to calcium, and so calmodulin dependent kinase, so think calcium, and also does PGC1 alpha, going to be related to endurance training. mTOR is going to be one with muscle size and those contractile proteins. So mTOR is going to be from that, kind of leading from resistance training into increased muscle size. And so all that's kind of laid out here, showing the endurance training that kind of connects and all that signaling. Don't need you to know every step. It's just trying to get you to see that big picture of what's going on. And so realize that these kind of happen in order and at different time frames. So those main ones are going to happen within seconds, right? Calcium is released very quickly. The muscle stretch from endurance training is going to happen within seconds. Then the second messengers will kind of hit within minutes, and then from there we'll start the signaling of things in hours, and that's going to take days for us to actually see those created. Our body works quick, but to see overall changes that can be measured will take some time. Let's see, so we also see some biochemical adaptations from training with exercise, and so that's where when you exercise you're going to see less epinephrine, norepinephrine, or adrenaline released into the nervous system. You're also going to see a decrease in heart rate and ventilation at any given workload between trained and untrained. So your heart rate's not going to go as high when you're trained at the same activity level as you were when you were untrained. So treadmill 5 miles an hour, heart rate gets up to 150. You train for 12 weeks, run at 5 miles an hour on a treadmill, maybe your heart rate's only 120. And what's crazy is that the signaling pathways for these don't translate throughout the whole body. So basically, if you train one way, so maybe in this example, they trained one leg. We did one leg training. We saw a decrease in heart rate, a decrease in epinephrine, and then we started using the other leg that was not trained. We saw that those decreases in heart rate and epinephrine levels did not carry over. They had to train on its own. So just because you're running doesn't mean that your arms are necessarily going to do that. It might be a bad example because you use your arms running. So biking, the legs are doing well. We see these changes, and then you switch to some kind of arm exercise. We may have to train again for those adaptations to occur. And so that's seen here. Training, let's say your left leg, do that for 12 weeks. We see these decreases in ventilation, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and then when we switch to the right leg, those jump back up and have to undergo their own training processes. Now, they tend to seem to happen maybe a little bit quicker. The body's more accustomed to it, but it does still need to train on itself. So with that, training-induced reductions in heart rate and ventilation can be due to basically improved steady state during exercise, reduced feedback from muscles. So basically think your pH is being more controlled, you're getting more O2 in, all of these feedback chemical receptors and mechanical receptors are not feeding back into the system, and so we don't see this increase in heart rate as much, and there's less feedback to the cardiorespiratory system. And so this reduces the signals being sent and the recruitment of muscle fibers, and so that's going to just help us all together with needing less. And this kind of goes over those pathways and how those would flow. So one of the biggest things to note is that detraining, so if you stop exercise, the VO2 max also changes. Remember that principle of reversibility. So there's a rapid decrease in VO2 max when you stop training. So you lose approximately 8% of your VO2 within 12 days of training, and you'll lose approximately 20% after 84 days, somewhere around 2 to 3 months, almost 3 months. Stroke volume max, there's a rapid loss in plasma volume, which is going to decrease stroke volume max. And so what you're going to see is that stroke volume goes up first, but it also comes down first. Maximal AVO2 difference goes up later, but then it comes down later because of the signaling. So when your body realizes it doesn't need mitochondria, it gets rid of them. We start losing oxidative capacity in the muscle because of that, and then we see this conversion from type 2A fibers to type 2X, so getting rid of those endurance fibers. And so the initial decrease in VO2 is from stroke volume, and then later from AVO2. Again, think those curves when they occurred as well. So working in reverse order. And this kind of shows you what's happening over time. And remember, heart rate will start to increase with the same workload, right? If we're not training, heart rate, all of those things are going back up because the signals are there. pH is going down, we're needing more oxygen, all of those things will occur. So the cool thing is that retraining, muscle mitochondria adapt quickly. So within about 5 weeks, you're going to see a double in mitochondria with training. The loss then happens quickly. So if you stop training, you'll see about a 50% loss within 1 week. So taking a week off, there's a reason it's harder to start back because you've lost some things very rapidly. A majority is lost within even just 2 weeks. But if you start retraining, you gain those mitochondria back just a little bit quicker than the first time. And so that's seen with this. Untrained, go back to training. If you detrain all the way, you'll be back to that in about the same time frame as it took you to get there. But if you take 1 week off and start retraining, it's still going to take you a little while to get back to where you were. So losses happen quickly, gains do not. So what about anaerobic exercise? Because we haven't really talked about that. Remember, anaerobic, we're talking short duration, 10 to 30 seconds, usually all-out exercise like sprint training. You're going to recruit both 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So remember, if it's less than 10 seconds, it's primarily the ATP-PC system. If it's lasting 20 to 30 seconds, majority is coming from anaerobic systems, a little bit from aerobic. They're starting to produce energy, but you're seeing how that energy utilization is going to change and what system we're training there. And so with aerobic training, 4 to 10 weeks of sprint training, we can increase power by 3 to 28%. Again, genetics does play a role here. And so what happens when we do anaerobic training is we increase buffering capacity. So hydrogen ions don't play as big of a role in that short exercise. They build up, but we can buffer them for a short time in order for us to continue to compete or to use our muscles at a high intensity. We also see more activation of our type 2 muscle fibers and hypertrophy. So we're making those type 2 muscle fibers bigger so that every time they contract, they're producing more power, more energy. And we also increase the enzymes for ATP-PC and our glycolysis, again, to continue to produce ATP for all those myosin heads to contract. We will, if you do something like high-intensity interval training that's over 30 seconds, but really close to VO2 max, we'll promote some mitochondrial biogenesis to help you recover and to use some of that energy at the, as the exercise progresses over 30 seconds. So with that, we kind of covered a lot of those kind of the things here. What you should be able to do is start making the connection with what we talked about here to the past chapters and why those make a difference. That's the goal is, okay, you knew all these things. We talked about energy systems, muscle fibers types. Now, how are they playing a role? And so can you make the connections on the quick lecture here versus all the things you've already learned?